Equity now is the new word. It's code for black people are systemically victims of systemic racism. Black people are being oppressed by white people. It's code for we're the good guys, meaning the Democrats, and you guys over there are the bad guys. Watch Kamala Harris.
Because we recognize not everybody starts out on the same base. They don't start out in the same place, even though they have the same God-given capacity.
We need to recognize not everybody starts in the same place. Is there a society anywhere in the world where everybody starts in the same place? Whether it's Chile, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's Sweden, whether it's America. In fact, think about your own household. If you were lucky enough to have siblings. Fast forward, you're now adults, you now have your own careers, your own jobs. Are you all in the same place? Are you all making the same amount of money? Do you all have the same size house, same kind of car, even though you were raised in the same household, attended the same schools, had the same parents? So within families, we don't have equal outcomes, even though there's an equal start. So how in the world are we going to have equal outcomes when there aren't equal starts in societies? But I digress.
How they buy inventory from local businesses. The whole community benefits in one way or another, economically, not to mention psychically, from their presence.
In the spirit of the interests of equity. In the spirit of equity. What does it even mean? I was watching football this weekend. I'm a football widower. My girlfriend loves football. Frankly, I could take it or leave it. Her favorite team is the Rams, and when the Rams are losing, you don't want to be in the same room with her. You heard about all these men, supposedly, who when their team loses, they get mad and they engage in domestic violence. I'm not saying I'm a victim of domestic violence. I just stay away from the woman when the Rams have lost, and they lost this time. But I was watching one game with her, and the beginning of it, they show a little picture of all the players on defense, and then when offense takes over, they show a picture of all the players on offense. And in both cases, both teams, virtually every one of the players on both sides of the ball were black. Now, in the interests of equity, since blacks are only 30% of America, shouldn't 70% of these players be other than black? But Kamala Harris was just warming up.
And I've seen how they use that capital to hire people from the community, to open a new storefront on the main street, how they buy inventory from local businesses. The whole community benefits in one way or another, economically, not to mention psychically, from their presence.
Talking about making sure that we have equity in the way businesses are started. Equity. Now, again, this is the Democrat push for not equal rights, but equal outcomes. And it's insulting. Notice Kamala Harris says nothing at all about the fact that, say, for example, in Baltimore, there are 13, count them, 13 public high schools, urban high schools, where 0% of the kids can do math at grade level. And there's another half a dozen where only 6 can. That's almost half of the public high schools in Baltimore where the kids are either 0 math proficient or only 1% math proficient. Are they concerned about that lack of equity? Do they want to have school choice to address that lack of equity? No, of course not. And then you've got Janet Yellen, the Secretary of Treasury. Also, she's all about equity.
Since January of last year, the Biden-Harris administration has made racial equity a centerpiece of our economic agenda.
What exactly is racial equity? Does it mean that if you're Asian American, you ought not have a higher net worth than non-Asian Americans, which, by the way, is the case? That's right, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, and Korean Americans per capita have a higher net worth than white European Americans. Is that a lack of equity? What kind of nonsense is this?
Advancing racial equity is not just a moral priority, it is also vital to our economic success.
Advancing racial equity is not just a moral imperative, It's vital to our economic success. Advancing racial equity. What does that mean? Does that mean that we should have a equal percentage of people that are supermodels, who are male and females? Isn't the fact that women supermodels make a lot more money than male supermodels a lack of equity? What about plumbers? Have you noticed most plumbers tend to be men? Isn't that a lack of equity? Most secretaries tend to be females, as is the case with nurses, although that's changing. Shouldn't we be marching on Washington because of the lack of equity in the ranks of elementary school teachers, in the ranks of supermodels, in the ranks of nurses, in the ranks of plumbers? What about ditch diggers? How many female ditch diggers have you seen? And what about people who are behind bars? Have you ever noticed 90% of prisoners are men? Isn't that a decided, dramatic, scandalous lack of equity? But again, Janet Yellen was just warming up. Watch this one.
From Reconstruction to Jim Crow to the inequities that really continue to persist today, our economy has failed to live up to the nation's promise of equal opportunity for all.
I got a headache. From Jim Crow to right now, we failed to live up to the promise. Now, I've done a documentary. I'm executive producer. This is a sequel to my first documentary called Uncle Tom, directed by Justin Malone, co-written by Ryder Ansell, scored by a brilliant composer named Damon Criswell. And we talk about the fact in Uncle Tom 2, after slavery, a black child was more likely to be born under a roof with a biological mother and biological father than today. And again, forget about elder. Barack Obama once said a kid raised without a father is 5 times more likely to be poor and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in jail. Fast forward now, 70% of black kids are born outside of wedlock. Isn't that a lack of equity? But if it's because of racial injustice, how do you explain 70% in the year 2022 when by any measure, America is less racist than it was 100 years ago? How do you explain that? But there's no concern about that on the part of the left. The destruction of the nuclear intact family. 1940. So you're talking about, what, 40 plus 35, 75 years after slavery. It was rare for a black child to be born in America without a father married to the mother. However, 87% of blacks live below the poverty line. 20 years later, 1960, that number had fallen to 47%. That's a 40-point drop in a 20-year period of time, the greatest 20-year period of economic expansion in the history of America for black people. Why? Belief in strong families, belief in God, belief in the promise of American ideals, and belief in entrepreneurship. Now fast forward, you have streets where there's places where you wouldn't dare even walk. People like Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams, who grew up in the 40s, tell me that on hot summer days, they would sleep outside. Thomas Sowell grew up in Harlem, and Walter Williams grew up in Philadelphia. And because there were no air conditions, or the people couldn't afford air conditioning, they would sleep on grates, they would sleep on balconies, they would sleep on park benches without fear that young people would rob them, mug them, take their watches, kill them.